a really small cost to standing for peace and standing for justice and standing really for what, as Christians, we believe in God's kingdom of peace and justice coming into the world.
Hello and welcome to The Wedge. I'm your host, Dr. Joyce Del Rosario. This videocast highlights Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders working towards social justice. We call it The Wedge because Asian Americans are often wedged in the black and white binary conversations on race. We are tossed around as either model minorities or the perpetual foreigners who have the kung flu. But really, API folks are positioned to help break the binary conversations to move us toward justice and equity for all people. The Wedge introduces Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are doing great things in their community. In this first season, we will focus on API pastors, practitioners, and academics who have invested themselves in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I hope you enjoy this series. Why don't you just start us off and just tell us who you are, what you do, where you live. Just give us an idea of your social location, your geographic location, things like that.
Yeah, so we are living in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, specifically in the St. Paul area. We both grew up in Wisconsin and went to LA for a couple years, and then came out here back to the Midwest. Our ethnicity is Hmong American. I'm second generation. Durr is technically like 1.5, but our parents were refugees. And so that's kind of the place where we're coming from. I am a lawyer by trade. I worked as a staff attorney for a number of years for a Christian nonprofit. But right now I'm taking a break from practicing law and I work for state government here in Minnesota.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, and we've been married for coming up on 11 years. We've got 2 little ones, and I have come from a background of ministry. Right now, I am a bivocational pastor at a small church plant here in St. Paul. And we kind of call ourselves a multi-ethnic church of misfits. We're just figuring it out as this pandemic, is all of our reality right now. So that's a little bit of who we are.
Great, thanks. Well, the Wedge is really focused on Asian Americans doing social justice work. And I know we'll get to some particularities of your work in a minute, but I wanted to just get in general an understanding of why does justice matter to you? I mean, you're Pastor Durr and Alice, you're a lawyer. And so by vocation, justice matters to you, but I wanted to kind of hear maybe a story or just kind of how did you come upon having this be an important piece of who you are?
Absolutely. You want me to start? Sure. Yeah, I think for me, I grew up in a lot of predominantly white context, non-Christian. But then when I came to faith, I continued in those large white churches. And it wasn't long before I, realized there were a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of issues that were not brought up, or at least not at the forefront of what it meant to be a Christian in that setting. Specifically issues of, people of color, Black voices, racism, and I was going through my own ethnic identity journey. But the thing that I think I really realized was that all people of color, they come up against white supremacy. And as an Asian American, obviously my encounter with white supremacy looks different from a Black person's. But then I started to realize that the thing kind of like robbing all of us was this value of white supremacy. And if we didn't bring that to the forefront, especially as Jesus followers, then it was distorting who the church was. It was distorting our role in society. So I kind of saw it as my role to kind of make sense of my own Asian American experience with white supremacy first, And then hearing the Black experience, of white supremacy, which has a much longer history in this country than like a Hmong American, history of it, really just opened my eyes to, Black authors, Black theologians, Black friends, just hearing their stories. I think that's when it really solidified that like this is a deeply theological issue, not merely an isolated political or social issue. They're all obviously integrated, and that's when I felt like you couldn't dismiss this issue. Like you had to kind of either stand in solidarity with it, or you were okay with the status quo. So, and I wasn't okay with that.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, so I think for me, justice in a general sense has always kind of been important to me. Growing up, I feel like naturally I had a really strong like fairness meter internally. And so when things felt unfair, I always had to say something about it, whether it was like, a tiny little thing about like sharing when we were young or to today. And so I felt like because I'm
out of your kids when they do that.
yeah, so now we have to navigate that, right? But I still try to gauge it as like fairness, even though they don't fully understand it sometimes. But yeah, so for me, like personality-wise, I'm more of a practical thinker. And so what does justice look like practically for me? And so for me, it was the call to go to law school and practice law, because I felt like I couldn't do what I wanted to do without that law degree. It opens doors for you to be able to do certain things like take people to court or like speak on someone else's behalf and be an advocate. And so that's kind of the heart of justice for me. And growing up, I grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood, lower to middle class. And so we witnessed a lot of things as people of color in those neighborhoods, and as a child of refugees who opened their own business and then still had to deal with so many issues and buying homes and redlining in the city where I grew up. And so all of that contributed to why I wanted to practice law. And so in terms of Black Lives Matter, I mean, I echo a lot of what Dur said, and being in community with Black friends, having people who we call our close friends and hearing their stories, and growing up the way we did in the 90s with the predominantly Black community and refugee community, we experienced some of the same hardships. But of course, the Black community has experienced it for so much longer. And so we have to work from that place first and unravel like the injustices that their community faces in order for us all to be able to reap the fruit of that work.
There's a particular post that you did on Facebook, and it was a picture of you standing at a Black Lives Matter rally, and I believe the cardboard sign that you had said Hmong American for Black Lives. And the comments after were pretty stunning. And so I'd love for you to tell, both of you to tell me, how was that, making a stance, a public stance, a social media stance that way, and how did your community respond?
Yes, overall, it was a lot of positive comments. And I even felt like for the positive comments, it was kind of like in secrecy, like, I'm going to message this to you that I support what you're doing, but I think behind their words is like, but I probably couldn't do it kind of thing. So overwhelmingly positive. And then there was the obvious backlash and criticism, which that really took a toll on me. You have to like learn how to put up like some thick armor and like know who the audience is and kind of expect some of that backlash. Yeah, I mean, I suspected that the pushback was fueled by a lot of people's own, when I say people, a lot of the Hmong American peers and their own encounter with prejudice from the Black community, their own racial trauma. And so if they're processing this whole thing from that place, then to them, it just looks like complete foolishness that I would do what I did. A lot of them saw it as, what's that?
Right, what was foolish about it?
Yeah, that I would put my body in a place where, you know, potentially I could have gotten assaulted or, you know, whatever. I think people are just going in with their imaginations. That I would put my body in a place where I could be at risk in in a mob of, you know, again, I don't know what they were imagining, right?
But I think people also were like, why are you standing up for Black people? They didn't
Yeah.
stand up for you. They didn't do anything for you.
Yes.
Where was the Black community when Asians were facing racism in regards to the coronavirus?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the comments were, you know, a lot of them were just, where was the Black community when this happened? Where was the Black community helping you with this? Just wait till you get assaulted. Where's the Black community going to be?
I wanted to point out that in our communities of color across the United States, there's these tensions that we live with, and then these explosion points that seem to be happening. And so anyway, keep going.
Yeah, I feel like people don't remember their history, right? And so I say that because Hmong people have only been in the US since about 1974, 1975, and that was the very early wave. The majority of them came in the mid 80s to early 90s. And we failed to remember or even acknowledge that we were brought here post-Vietnam. The Vietnam War was not popular in the US at all. And so on top of that, we're brought over here by the thousands, Southeast Asians, not just us, but the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Lao people, Hmong people, as refugees. And so we come and they pretty much just drop us into these predominantly Black and Latino communities. And so what happened was we're struggling for the same resources. And there aren't that many resources to begin with. And so we're sitting here trying to make it multi-generational families. And there's a ton of us because our families are large. And so rumors started swirling between the communities saying, you know, Hmong people get like $7,000 for coming here. They don't have to pay taxes for 7 years. Each family gets a car, which was all untrue. Right. But because we were placed into like the projects, there was competition for housing, right? Our schools, like a lot of our friends went to inner city schools. And so friends of mine where we grew up said like they would get into fights at school with Black kids. But then they would come home and their neighbors are Black and they're sitting on each other's porches, getting their hair braided by their neighbors, you know, Black parents watching out for them also. And so it was this really weird mixture. And what happened was the government didn't do anything to help smooth that process. They kind of just threw us all in there and said, this is America, you need to survive, you better make it, we're not helping you. And so that's kind of what was the start of our parents' lives in the US. And so we failed to remember that, and we failed to recognize that, like, what was the Black community's experience at that time when we came in like that? And it wasn't either of our faults. It just was the situation. And what I wish would have happened was either the government or community groups, nonprofits, churches would have come together and said, this is why this people group is coming into the neighborhood. And this is the trauma that they're carrying with them. And so we need to understand this. But because that didn't happen, what happened later then in the 90s when our siblings, like my older brothers who are now late 30s, early 40s, they joined gangs. And so then you've got Hmong people appropriating Black culture, but also trying to keep their distance from Black people, getting into fights with them. You know, it was weird because like we resonated so much with the Black community, but we were like enemies at the same time, while also still trying to figure out our way in America. And so I think all of that still lingers. And that wasn't that long ago, you know, 15 years ago, maybe. Not even a generation has passed yet. Yeah. And so that stuff is still fresh. And so up here where there's a huge Hmong community where like you don't actually need to step out of that Hmong community because there's so many people. When you see pictures like Durs on Facebook, a lot of the backlash is like, you need to help your people. You know, where are you when this happened? You should be only helping your people. And for us, it was, you can hold both. You know, you don't need to just help your people. That's really like orphan mentality, right? Like we got to help our own before we can help anyone else. That's just not true. And we don't operate from that lens.
It's scarcity mentality.
Yeah.
I love how you juxtaposed the refugee experience with the African American experience in the 90s, in the middle of really high gang activity.
Mm-hmm.
And so while there, you mentioned the sort of the rumors of like $7,000 checks and free cars, the Black community in that time was struggling with the, the single moms, taking welfare money and like having babies just so they could get welfare checks, and addicts and all of that. And so they had their own stereotypes that they were battling. And so both communities, I mean, you said it so well, both communities were existing in this really difficult spot together, and were just kind of thrown in together into the neighborhood. And of course tensions we were pitted against each other, and so, yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, the only experience that we've, as Americans, that we may have even like touched on in that time was like Gran Torino, right? Like with Clint Eastwood. Like that's the closest we could understand the Hmong American experience, particularly with youth at the time, and that was it. Like that's anyway, we won't digress on that one, but but that's a tiny little sliver. Whether depicted well or not, but here you are as a people group having this enormous experience, and none of us understand or know. So yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. How did this impact your family? I mean, you're together, you have 2 kids, you're just trying to live, the American dream, however we want to define that. How did this impact you as a family, taking a stance in solidarity with Black lives?
Yeah, I can start. So the week that George Floyd was murdered, I mean, I've been with my kids a lot. I got laid off, so I'm bivocational pastor with my 2 kids, and usually I'm playing with them or I'm taking them outside. And the week that George Floyd was murdered, I was just like really quiet around my daughter, my 6-year-old. She's the older one. And then I just had to share it with her exactly what happened, and I didn't know how to sugarcoat it. And I just wanted to make her aware of just the brokenness that we live in, and that's what was bothering me. And so I think it impacted my relationship that way, where she could tell something was off with me, something was bothering me, and then explaining to her why I was going to the protest. And I felt like as a 6-year-old, she was very understanding of it. But between the 4 of us, I think there was also a sense of like, how far do we want to, make like a public stance before the point where we get, hate notes or threats or whatever. There was some guy on Facebook who took my picture with this holding the sign that said Hmong Americans for Black Lives, and he photoshopped it with something really immature. I don't even know what it said, but it was obviously photoshopped.
I remember this actually.
Yeah.
It said because I'm scared of them.
Yeah,
I think that's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like when those little things started happening, so I think in the back of our minds it's like, okay, how do we keep our family safe? We don't know who lives local here who can have such strong feelings against this, that we don't know what people are capable of doing within our own community. Yeah. So I think those thoughts crossed our mind, but again, I kind of just interpret it as like, this is the price that I'm willing to pay, just to at least just stand there, put my body there, and make a stance, just to say that this is not okay, and we can imagine a new world, a new way of being human together.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that day that he was going to go to this protest, and it was pretty early on in the protests, before the 3rd precinct was burned down. Mm-hmm. And so, we've all heard by now that there was the cops standing by while George Floyd was murdered was Hmong. Mm-hmm. And because we're such a collective community, that resonated with everyone. You picked a side, whether or not you for or against it, and so.
Two-Tao, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Two-Tao, yep. And so that day when he was going to go, after he left, it was just me and the kids because, like obviously it's not safe to take our kids, especially with the pandemic. And so I remember thinking, what if he doesn't come back? What if they see this Asian man and think you're just like Tu Tao and harm him? And then I remember thinking also, wait, this is probably what Black mothers and wives go through, like on a daily basis.
Mhm.
Just their sons, husbands, whatever, going out to get groceries or whatever. There's probably this inherent fear. And so for me, that was like, it was kind of humbling to think, okay, this is one day, but the Black community goes through this every day.
Mhm.
And so I will pray for him and the community, but he needs to be out there. He needs to stand there with the Black community. And I think there was only a handful of other Asian people there.
That I saw,
Yeah, so like all the feedback we got online of just wait till you get beat up, just wait till you get assaulted. It was all wrong, because when Dur was actually there, and you can explain it, like he actually received really positive feedback from the Black community who was there with his sign.
Yeah.
Were those threats a form of anti-Blackness? Is that, were they assuming that Black people would?
Oh yeah.
There?
Yep, 100%. It was just wait till they assault you.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but to Alice's point, I had a very different experience while I was there. Overwhelmingly positive. It was a lot of men and women, Black or otherwise, asking me very politely, "Can I take your picture? Is it okay if I take your picture?" Had a couple of, as Pastor TC and I were leaving, we had been on the scene for a couple of hours there. As we were walking away, a Black man rode up on his moped just to chase us down to say, hey, man, I really can't tell you how much I respect your sign. Thank you for being out here. You don't know how much that meant to me. So that was, I mean, that kind of stuff is just heartwarming, that little sign can speak volumes to a community that was hurting.
Yep.
So stuff like that. And I wish my Hmong, counterparts could see that it was not the negative experience they had imagined in their minds, but actually really, really healing and restorative.
My allergies are acting up. But that's the beauty of it, right? Like when we show love, when we live out of an abundance and instead of that scarcity that we were talking about, love comes back. Like that's tremendous. And I love that person got to experience that from you, Hmong American, but it cost you. It cost, I try to tell people with privilege, solidarity cost. And like you can make the apologies and you can make the statements, but if it's not costing you anything, you're not giving anything. Your privilege, there's no evening. It's just your privilege kind of being charitable. And that doesn't change it. But your willingness to pay the cost as a family begets more love. And oh gosh, that's incredible. That's powerful. I wish we could see that every day. I wish we could see that every day. You've shared so many really powerful things right now. If you were speaking right now specifically to the Hmong American community, what do you want them to understand about what it means to be, being the wedge in the Black-white binary conversations? We've been used as a pawn, mostly, totally by white supremacy. And however, whether it's Kung Flu or model minority, whatever the white supremacist system wants us to be for its own, for its own privileges and its own power. But the wedge is also an opportunity. And the wedge is also a way for us to be able to speak into that binary and mess up that binary enough that we start breaking down those scarcity systems and those other fears and things like that. So what would you want to share to your community specifically about being the wedge in this Black-white racial conversation?
In speaking to the model minority myth, we have taken on the privilege of being model minorities, honorary whites for too long. And specifically to the Hmong community, we are not the model minority, and we need to stop holding on to that and stop comparing ourselves to other people. Stop comparing us to the Black community and saying, well, we did this, we were able to do this. we also haven't been oppressed in the US for 400 years, you know? And so I guess my kind of plea to the Hmong community is to step outside of your community, expand your circles, get to know people in other communities like the Black community, Latino, Indigenous groups. We need to understand their stories also. And I've been saying since that week that George Floyd was murdered, I really believe that Black liberation is liberation for us all, because when Black people are finally treated as human beings with dignity, that means that we will all see the fruit of that. And I've shared with many people, Joyce, you know, Dom, when we were in Pasadena, I remember Dom saying that she was going to be unapologetically Black on July 4th, right? And I remember her wearing like a necklace of Africa, and I just was confused because I was like, what does that even mean? You know, because I had not experienced it. But then when I witnessed her being fully African American, being proud of being a Black woman and who God created her to be, all of a sudden something opened up for me to be able to live that truth for myself. What does it mean to be unapologetically Hmong American? And I can hold all the pieces of my identity and still be proud of who I am. You know, I don't have to like, because I don't speak Hmong well, I'm not Hmong, you know, all of that. Yeah. So seeing Dom represent that, I was like, you know what? I could do that too, right. You know? And so to see her free in her identity allowed me to be free in my identity. And that was only one thing, and that will ripple, right? If we see the Black community, like I imagine like the Black community, our neighborhoods, no more check cashing places on the corners, like robbing our communities of their paychecks, you know, schools having resources. What does that mean for all of us? It means we will all have access to the same resources. You know, we're not better than anyone else. We are all just trying to make it. We're still all trying to make it, right? But if we support the Black community to rise up, that also means that we support ourselves and other people. Yep. So.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's powerful. I love it every time Alice shares about Dom. It gets me going too. I'm like, yes.
It's inspirational to a lot of us that are friends with her, that's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna answer a little bit of that question. So the only thing I wanted to add was that, like, speaking specifically to the Hmong American community, because we're so new in this country, we're, you know, 1975, my family didn't come here until 1986. And a lot of us are still dealing with the trauma of the history of, you know, in Laos and Thailand and just the Indo-Chinese wars, that we haven't taken the time or the opportunity to learn the history here, that during civil rights, you know, the Black community and the Black civil rights leaders have done so much of the work for us before we got here, that when we got here in 75, we've already tasted a little bit of, I mean, you know, not true equality, but we've tasted it more than we would have if the Black community, if the civil rights didn't happen. And so I think Hmong Americans can learn and appreciate that, like, the Black community has already done so much for people of color in America, and we just showed up on the scenes and like we're like able to vote and things like that. And so I think that'd be my encouragement to my own community. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both so much. And yeah, our special shout out to our friend Dominique Robinson Coleman.
Yes.
And I right, I think that's the symbiotic relationship is when we see unapologetically Black, you know, brilliance and love, and you know, that does inspire other people of color like us to love ourselves unapologetically, right? With that internalized colonization, which I'll cover in another episode, is so deep. There's so much self-hate, and all you know, a lot of us people of color have. That's what the Wedge does, is that it creates a self-hate, but there's also this opportunity for love in like exponential ways. And so thank you both so much for sharing. I'm gonna have to sit and meditate and chew on everything, because like that, there were so many layers of just a really good thought. And so I just really appreciate who you are. I appreciate where you are and what you're doing and how you're living. I appreciate you as friends, my personal friends. But man, keep up the good work. Keep living with integrity and love, and hopefully we'll have more and more moments of that kind of outpouring of love with one another, with our not just our Black friends, but our communities as a whole, right? Like that's, you know, as faith people, right? Like that's what we understand God's love to be, is something that's just contagious, and something that we can continue to share with one another.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, Joyce.
Love you. All right. Thank you.